Every day, we see the darker side of the world around us. We witness how people can hurt others in ways that are hard to understand. It's a sad part of life, but it's something we can't ignore. As someone who dives into the world of crime, I'm here to share the most shocking stories and try to understand what drives people to do such things. I'm Michael, and today, I've got another unreal true crime story for you. The house was quiet, but the fear inside was loud. A family was trapped in a room, holding their breath, hoping the locked door would keep them safe. Then, a gunshot. The lock shattered. Someone fell. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Whoever was inside wasn't in a rush. This wasn't a random break-in. It was planned. By morning, police arrived to find a crime scene that didn't make sense. It looked like a robbery, but nothing was stolen. The signs pointed to one person, but the real question was, who was really in control? As detectives searched for answers, they realized this wasn't just about love, jealousy, or even revenge. Someone had pulled all the strings, and by the time the truth came out, it was more shocking than anyone expected. Nathaniel Huey Jr. was born around 1993 into an environment where crime and violence were the norm. From childhood, Nathaniel exhibited a reckless and defiant nature. School never interested him. He frequently fought with classmates, challenged authority, and ignored academics altogether. His first encounter with law enforcement came in his teenage years when he was caught participating in a robbery. However, due to his age, he avoided severe consequences. It didn't take long for him to realize that a life of crime provided more than just an adrenaline rush. It also offered financial gain. His offenses escalated, and by 2016, he found himself behind bars for assault. A year later, he was arrested again for driving under the influence. But what truly fascinated Nathaniel was weaponry. He amassed a collection of firearms, frequently showcasing them on social media. His online presence was filled with images of handguns, rifles, and ammunition, attracting the attention of law enforcement. Eventually, the courts banned him from possessing firearms, but Nathaniel had no intention of complying. Instead, he turned to the black market, acquiring weapons through illegal means. Despite his criminal record, he attempted to present himself as a legitimate businessman. He launched a private security company, though it operated without proper licensing. Legally, he wasn't even allowed to carry a weapon, yet he flaunted his supposed authority on social media, posting images of himself in tactical gear, heavily armed. On the other side of the story was Irmelinda Palomo, born on February 3, 1973. By the time she met Nathaniel, she was a fiercely independent woman, a mother of 5, and already a grandmother. Her upbringing had been relatively stable, though her personal life had been filled with struggles. She had married young, but the relationship ended, leaving her to raise her children alone. Determined to provide for them, she worked multiple jobs, balancing the responsibilities of both a mother and a grandmother. She was strict with her family, earning both respect and occasional resentment. When she crossed paths with Nathaniel, those around her struggled to understand the connection. He was 20 years younger, had a volatile history, and embodied the kind of chaos she had spent her life avoiding. Some claim they met through mutual friends, But regardless of how it happened, their relationship progressed quickly. At first, Ermelinda dismissed him, but his confidence, persistence, and dangerous charm pulled her in. For Nathaniel, she was a source of stability, someone who offered him a sense of security he had never known. For her, it was something new, an experience that gave her the illusion of control over a man who lived recklessly. Their bond was unconventional, an attraction built on stark differences. Before long, they moved in together, and Ermelinda's children and grandchildren shared the same crowded space. Yet, their home was far from harmonious. Nathaniel's obsession with weapons never faded. Despite legal restrictions, he continued to acquire and display firearms, making under-the-table deals and exploiting legal loopholes. Guns were more than a collection to him. They were an extension of his identity. He carried a weapon at all times, even inside the house, often dismantling and cleaning his firearms at the kitchen table. Ermelinda initially overlooked this behavior. She cared more about the money he brought in than the legality of his business. But over time, she noticed that his interests weren't just financial. Nathaniel was unpredictable. His temper flared over the smallest inconveniences, a misplaced word, an unwelcome glance. He could go from seething anger to eerie calm in seconds, as if nothing had happened. The first person to voice concern was Christina, one of Ermelinda's daughters. Unlike others who ignored the warning signs, she saw Nathaniel for what he was: dangerous. She watched how he spoke about violence, how he carried himself with arrogance, how he refused to be contradicted. But what frightened her most was how easily he could lose control. By 2021, Nathaniel and Ermelinda had lived together for 6 years. Outwardly, things seemed stable, but the foundation of their relationship had long since crumbled. Nathaniel had never been faithful, but his affairs had now become routine. He used social media to meet new women, engaged in secret conversations, and erased his messages meticulously. He often left late at night, offering vague excuses about work or business meetings. Ermelinda would wake in the middle of the night, only to find him gone. By dawn, he'd return without explanation. Nathaniel never worried about being caught. He assumed Ermelinda either wouldn't find out or wouldn't dare confront him. He believed he held all the power, but he underestimated her. At first, Ermelinda ignored the red flags, but soon, the pattern became impossible to dismiss. The late nights, the hidden messages, his sudden concern with his appearance. It all pointed to something she couldn't ignore. Her suspicions were confirmed the moment she saw a message pop up on his phone. It left no room for doubt. Instead of reacting immediately, Ermelinda decided to gather proof. If Nathaniel thought he was untouchable, he was about to learn otherwise. She started watching him more closely, tracking his movements, paying attention to his habits, even checking his messages when he wasn't looking. Soon, she could tell when he was lying, when he was covering his tracks, when he was slipping away for yet another secret meeting. The more she uncovered, the deeper her anger grew. She saw two paths ahead: leave him and erase him from her life, or make him regret every single choice that led him to this point. And the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She wasn't going to be just another woman he discarded. If she wanted to hurt him, she needed to do it smartly. Instead of an explosive argument, she chose a different tactic. She would make him feel trapped. She would turn his own world against him. The first step was deception. Ermelinda created fake social media accounts, carefully selecting photos, fabricating identities, and crafting believable personas. She studied online scams, learning the tricks used to manipulate and deceive. She learned the language of threats, the hierarchy of underground networks, and the techniques of psychological warfare. But her most valuable weapon was information. She figured out how to track locations, access hidden data, and manipulate the digital world in ways Nathaniel wouldn't see coming. Then she set her plan in motion. The first contact came from a woman who appeared to be deeply interested in Nathaniel. As expected, he took the bait. He responded eagerly, unaware that he was falling into Ermelinda's trap. At first, their messages seemed harmless, nothing more than casual flirtation. But then she started dropping hints, small details about his life that she shouldn't have known. She let him believe that someone was watching him, keeping track of his movements. Then came the moment that sent his paranoia spiraling, one simple message with his real-time location. Nathaniel was rattled. Ermelinda could see it in his face, in the way he started glancing over his shoulder, double-checking his surroundings. But she was far from finished. The next wave of deception introduced new players. Nathaniel started receiving messages from different people, some threatening, others pretending to offer protection. They reached out from different platforms, different numbers, never following a predictable pattern. Some demanded money, others warned him to stay away from certain places. A few hinted that he was already too deep into something far bigger than himself. None of it made sense to him, but that was the point. His behavior changed almost overnight. He became restless, anxious. He avoided answering unknown calls, constantly checked his surroundings, and even asked Ermelinda to drive him places just to make sure he wasn't being followed. He changed his passwords, deleted messages, anything to shake off the invisible threat he couldn't understand. But the more he tried to escape it, the deeper he fell into Ermelinda's trap. She watched with satisfaction as paranoia took hold of him. What he didn't realize was that the real threat was living under the same roof. Then, in May 2023, someone else entered the picture. Zoraida. She was one of Nathaniel's co-workers, a woman whose life was already tangled in its own web of secrets. Married with 2 children, Zoraida wasn't content in her home life. Infidelity wasn't new to her. She had strayed before and didn't feel guilty about it. To her, personal happiness was more important than loyalty. Nathaniel saw her as an escape, something fresh and exciting. His relationship with Ermelinda was not working, and Zoraida gave him the thrill he craved. It started with stolen glances, then hushed conversations, and soon they were wrapped up in something neither of them cared to stop. Ermelinda had been monitoring Nathaniel long enough to notice when his behavior changed. At first she thought Zoraida was just another fleeting affair, but then she saw the messages. They weren't just flirting. They were making promises. Nathaniel told Zoraida he loved her, that he wanted a future with her. Zoraida said the same. They fantasized about running away together, creating a new life, one without Ermelinda. Reading those words, Ermelinda felt something she hadn't before. This wasn't just betrayal. This was humiliation. She had spent months making him believe he was under attack. And yet, despite all of it, he was still out there, chasing after another woman, living his life as if none of her efforts had mattered. Now, she needed to destroy him. She intensified the psychological torment, introducing even more terrifying figures into Nathaniel's world. He was no longer just being watched, he was being hunted. Nathaniel had been through too much to be afraid anymore. He had survived the worst of it, or so he believed. The only thing that mattered to him anymore was Zoraida. Walking away from her wasn't an option. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just covering up an affair, he was fighting for it. Ermelinda saw the shift in him. If she couldn't break Nathaniel directly, she would destroy Zoraida instead. Her first move was to shake the foundation of Zoraida's home. Using her network of fabricated accounts, she reached out to Zoraida's husband, Alberto. At first, she planted subtle doubts, anonymous messages hinting at betrayal. She even attached photos of Zoraida and Nathaniel together, making sure there was no room for misinterpretation. But Alberto wasn't easily provoked. He brushed off the warnings, unwilling to believe his wife could betray him so brazenly. That was when Ermelinda escalated her tactics. The next wave of messages wasn't just about infidelity, it was about danger. This time, the threats were direct. Letters arrived at their home, unsigned but clear. If he didn't take action, his family would suffer. Alberto started watching Zoraida more closely. The unease inside their home was exactly what Ermelinda had planned for. Yet, Nathaniel still wouldn't let go. Even as paranoia crept into his life, he clung to Zoraida like she was his last lifeline. Now, Linda made him believe that Zoraida was the one feeding the people who were spying on him with information. She carefully pieced together a story so convincing that even he had to question what was real. Using her fake accounts, she sent messages from fabricated informants, each one hinting at the same thing. Zoraida wasn't just some woman he had fallen for. She was working against him. She was the reason the threats kept coming. The paranoia finally consumed him. Nathaniel confronted Ermelinda with his suspicions, and she played her role perfectly. She acted hesitant at first, then reluctantly admitted that she too had been warned about Zoraida. Nathaniel couldn't ignore it anymore. The only way to survive was to act. Then came the final test of loyalty. Ermelinda let him believe that his so-called enemies were watching his every move, and they needed proof that he wasn't compromised. There was only one way to prove he wasn't a traitor. The choice was his. By the time Nathaniel made his decision, there was no hesitation left in him. There was no fear, no regret, only a cold, calculated determination to do what had to be done. The planning began immediately. Nathaniel approached the situation like a mission. He studied Zoraida's habits, tracking her schedule and pinpointing when she was most vulnerable. He took note of when Alberto was home, when the children were asleep, when the house would be easiest to enter. He mapped out possible escape routes, watching for surveillance cameras, memorizing the neighborhood's layout. At the same time, he prepared his supplies. He already had a stockpile of weapons, but he gathered other tools, clothing to blend into the night, gloves to avoid leaving prints, tape, a flashlight. He and Ermelinda shopped together, selecting items carefully, making sure no one would suspect a thing. Ermelinda stayed in the background, never directly involved, but always guiding him in the right direction. By the time everything was in place, Nathaniel had stopped thinking about consequences. The night arrived. Ermelinda remained eerily calm as she drove toward Zoraida's house. She acted like it was just another night, even asking Nathaniel why he needed to go there, though she already knew the answer. He didn't respond. He didn't care what she thought anymore. All that mattered was the task ahead. When they reached the house, Ermelinda stayed in the car while Nathaniel stepped out. The front door was locked, just as he expected. He moved silently around the side of the house, found a window, and shattered the glass. The noise jolted Alberto awake. He sat up, listening. Then, he got out of bed and moved cautiously toward the sound. Nathaniel was already inside. The moment Alberto turned the corner, Nathaniel fired, but his aim was off. The bullet missed. Realizing instantly that this wasn't just a break-in, Alberto turned and ran, sprinting toward the hallway, desperate to reach his family's room before the intruder could. But Nathaniel was faster. The gunshots echoed through the house. Alberto collapsed before he could reach the door. For a few seconds, everything was silent. The first gunshot shattered the silence, sending Zoraida into a panic. Without thinking, she bolted toward the bedroom, dragging her children with her, slamming the door shut and locking it. Nathaniel was inside the house. She didn't know how many others were with him. She only knew she had to keep her family safe. Nathaniel reached the door moments later, slamming his shoulder against it, trying to force it open. It held firm. Frustrated, he took a step back, raised his gun, and fired at the lock. The bullet tore through the wood. On the other side, Zoraida gasped as the impact struck her. Her body stiffened, then she slumped forward. The door swung open. The children clung to each other, eyes wide with terror. The last sounds the neighbors heard were short, muffled gunshots. It was over in minutes. Nathaniel surveyed the scene, his breath steadying. Then he moved methodically, overturning furniture, pulling drawers open, scattering valuables onto the floor, staging the crime to look like a botched robbery. When he was done, he stepped over the bodies and walked back out into the night. Ermelinda was waiting in the car. She didn't ask how it went. She didn't have to. Without a word, they drove away, leaving chaos behind. The gunfire had woken the neighborhood. A few minutes passed before someone worked up the courage to dial 911. Within minutes, sirens filled the street. Officers arrived to find shattered glass, a broken door, and the unmistakable signs of forced entry. Inside, the bodies told a story far more sinister than a robbery gone wrong. Nathaniel had made mistakes, sloppy ones. Nothing valuable had been taken. The scattered belongings were just a weak attempt at deception. It was clear that this wasn't about theft. This was targeted, intentional. By sunrise, detectives were already tracing the crime back to the one person with a motive, Nathaniel Huey. Everyone at Zoraida's workplace knew about their affair. They hadn't exactly been discreet. The deeper detectives dug, the worse it got for Nathaniel. His past was riddled with crimes, assaults, illegal dealings, an arsenal of weapons. While police worked to gather evidence, Ermelinda kept playing her role. She continued messaging Nathaniel, still hiding behind the identity she had created. She reassured him that everything was under control, that the mafia was looking out for him, that as long as he followed instructions, he would remain safe. He believed her. But the investigation was moving faster than Ermelinda had expected. They combed through Nathaniel's recent activity, dissecting every call, every email, every text. One detail stood out. Over the past few months, he had been bombarded with anonymous threats, warnings of danger, claims that he was being hunted. Yet every single one of those messages had come from recently created accounts. If this was a true mafia operation, why did the evidence point solely to Nathaniel? The deeper they looked, the more the threats appeared staged, as if someone had been crafting a false reality just for him. That was the moment the investigation shifted. Nathaniel, meanwhile, was spiraling. He knew the police were closing in. He started noticing unmarked cars following him, strangers watching him too closely. He convinced himself that the mafia was still out there, waiting for him to make a mistake. He believed they would protect him. Desperate, he reached out to the only person he thought he could trust, his mother. He begged her for help, told her he was being accused of something terrible, that he needed to disappear. She refused to help him. Nathaniel had nowhere left to run. For a few days he managed to stay hidden, but security cameras eventually caught him in a grocery store. A manhunt began. Patrol cars swarmed the area, but by the time officers arrived, Nathaniel and Ermelinda had already slipped onto the highway. The chase was on. For miles, police followed, sirens blaring, but Nathaniel had no intention of stopping. He gripped the wheel, pushing the car faster, weaving through traffic, desperate to escape. She had orchestrated every move leading up to this moment, and now she was watching it all unfold exactly as she had planned. Up ahead, traffic thickened. Nathaniel tried to swerve around a truck, but his grip slipped. The tires screeched against the pavement. The car spun out of control, smashing into the guardrail, flipping multiple times before coming to a violent stop. Officers surrounded the wreckage, weapons drawn. Nathaniel was slumped in the driver's seat, a gun in his hand. Ermelinda was beside him, motionless. At some point in those final moments, he had turned the weapon on her, and then on himself. Investigators combed through the wreckage, trying to piece together what had happened in that car. Had he figured it out? The case didn't end there. Detectives turned their focus to Ermelinda's devices. Buried within her files were thousands of messages, chat logs, and notes detailing her manipulation of Nathaniel. Dozens of fake accounts, meticulously created and controlled. She had built this from the ground up. She had studied how to break a person's mind, how to weave fear so tightly around them that they would do anything to escape it. And it had worked. Nathaniel had never been hunted. There had never been a mafia. The real enemy had been sitting beside him the whole time. In the end, the case was closed. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Had Nathaniel figured it out before he pulled the trigger? Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations. Every day, we see the darker side of the world around us. We witness how people can hurt others in ways that are hard to understand. It's a sad part of life, but it's something we can't ignore. As someone who dives into the world of crime, I'm here to share the most shocking stories and try to understand what drives people to do such things. I'm Michael, and today, I've got another unreal true crime story for you. On the night of July 8, 2019, everything seemed quiet in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. But inside a house in Union Township, something terrifying was happening. Two young brothers sat frozen in fear. Marky Mason, just 8 years old, and his younger brother had no idea that their lives were about to change forever. A man they once trusted, a man who had been welcomed into their home, had suddenly turned violent. Yelling filled the air. Things were being thrown. Then a knife appeared, and the shouting turned into something even worse. In just minutes, everything fell apart, and by the end of the night, only one of the boys would survive. How did this happen? Who was the man responsible? And could it have been prevented? This is the heartbreaking story of Marky Mason, a little boy whose tragic fate left a community searching for answers and justice. Mark Edward Mason Jr., lovingly called Marky, was born on November 24, 2010, in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. He was the eldest son of Maram and Mark Mason Sr. Maram's journey to the U.S. began years before Marky's birth. Originally from Syria, she moved to Newcastle in 1999, facing the daunting challenge of adjusting to a new country without knowing English. She spoke only Syrian Arabic and French, making daily life difficult. Enrolled in the Newcastle area school district as a young student, she found a guiding hand in a French teacher who helped her navigate her new surroundings. Over time, Maram became fluent in English and pursued a certification in phlebotomy at Beaver County Community College. After completing her studies, Maram worked at ARC Human Services in Beaver County, assisting individuals with developmental challenges. To make ends meet, she also took a waitressing job at Olive Garden and another local restaurant. During this time, she met Mark Mason Sr., and the two eventually married, welcoming two sons, Marky first, followed by his younger brother a year later. Despite their best efforts, the marriage didn't last. When they divorced, Maram was granted custody of the boys, but both parents remained committed to co-parenting equally. They ensured that Marky and his brother grew up in a stable and loving environment. Their childhood in Newcastle was filled with the joys of sibling bonds, playful laughter, video game marathons, and the occasional argument over toys. Marky and his younger brother were inseparable, calling each other best friends. Marky loved riding his bike through the neighborhood, playing tag and watching cartoons. He had a deep passion for Legos, spending hours constructing elaborate designs. His love for adventure extended to the outdoors, where he enjoyed fishing trips with his father and exploring local parks. Weekends were special, as Marky and his mother would spend time cooking together, baking cookies, and preparing meals. He was also fascinated by superheroes, especially Spider-Man, and often imagined himself as a hero saving the day. This admiration for justice fueled his dream of one day becoming a SWAT team officer, a goal he eagerly shared with adults around him. Marky's intelligence was evident from an early age. At school, he excelled in math and art, displaying both an analytical mind and a creative spirit. His bright personality made him a natural at making friends, and teachers praised him for his kindness. Whether he was sharing snacks or comforting a lonely classmate, Marky always put others before himself. On the playground, he had a knack for organizing games so that everyone felt included, and if disagreements arose, he was often the one to mediate. It was clear that Marky had a promising future ahead. However, as time passed, his home life began to change in ways that sharply contrasted with the warmth he brought to school. The shift began when Maram entered a relationship with Keith Burley, a 43-year-old man who was serving time in prison. Their connection started through a website called WriteAPrisoner.com, a platform where inmates can create profiles and communicate with people on the outside through letters, emails, and phone calls. While some use these sites for support and companionship, others form deeper, even romantic relationships, just as Maram and Keith did. Keith's past was troubling. In 1999, at the age of 23, he was convicted of third-degree murder and burglary after shooting a Newcastle man in the back of the head. His sentence was 20 to 40 years in prison, a punishment that, given the severity of the crime, some might consider surprisingly lenient. While serving time in prison, Keith faced additional charges following two separate incidents in which he was accused of assaulting fellow inmates. It was during his incarceration that Maram stumbled across his profile on an inmate pen pal website. Out of curiosity, or perhaps a need for connection, she decided to send him a message. What started as an exchange of letters quickly deepened into something far more serious. Over the course of several months, their correspondence grew into a bond that raised many eyebrows. Against all odds, Keith had served only the minimum 20 years of his 20 to 40-year sentence. In March 2019, he was released on parole. With his newfound freedom, Keith and Maram's relationship transitioned from written words to real life. Maram soon introduced him to her two sons, a decision that their biological father strongly opposed. However, despite his objections, Keith wasted no time inserting himself into the children's lives. At first, everything seemed fine. He presented himself as a changed man, someone who had left his past behind. Marky and his younger brother, ever trusting, accepted him with open arms, even calling him by his nickname, Bud. Yet, beneath the surface, Keith remained the same volatile man he had always been. People who knew him described him as unpredictable, manipulative, and capable of explosive anger. Those closest to him often feared what he might do when provoked. His relationship with Maram soon reflected this side of him. Arguments became more frequent, and physical altercations were not uncommon. Before long, his presence shattered the once loving dynamic that Maram and her sons had shared, turning their home into a place of fear rather than security. Then came the night of July 8th, 2019, a night that would change everything. Maram had picked Keith up from a relative's house while her two boys dozed peacefully in the back seat of the family's car. Keith had planned to stay the night with them, as he often did. But tensions between the couple had been brewing for some time, and that evening they reached a breaking point. Needing to refuel, Maram pulled into a nearby gas station. She asked Keith if he could pump the gas for her. His response was immediate and furious. He flat out refused and snapped at her to do it herself. The argument escalated quickly. The topic shifted to Maram's missing phone, and frustration boiled over. Deciding she had had enough, Maram told Keith she was taking him back to where she picked him up. That's when Keith snapped. Enraged, he lunged at Maram, wrapping his left hand around her throat while his right fist pounded her face. A ring on his finger split the skin around her left eye, leaving a deep gash. Her cries of pain jolted the boys awake. As they opened their eyes, they saw their mother gasping for air, Keith's hand still around her neck. Terrified, they begged him to stop. Instead, he took his violence a step further, leaning in and biting Maram's cheek with brutal force. With blood trickling down her face, Maram fought through the pain and threw the car into drive. Her only thought was to get to safety. She sped toward the Newcastle Fire Department, desperate for help. The boys, sobbing in the back seat, clung to each other as their mother leaned on the car horn, trying to get the attention of anyone inside the fire station. But before anyone could intervene, Keith acted. He stormed out of the passenger seat, marched around the car, and yanked Maram from behind the wheel. Overpowering her with ease, he slammed her onto the pavement. Then, standing over her, he uttered 4 chilling words that would haunt her forever. "I'm kidnapping the children." Keith climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and sped off, leaving Maram battered on the ground, screaming in agony as she watched her terrified sons pressed against the car windows, helpless prisoners in their own vehicle. Keith drove the boys to a house in Union Township, a place neither of them had ever been before. After pulling into the dark driveway, he shoved them roughly inside. As soon as they stepped into the unfamiliar home, his rage exploded again. He began throwing objects around the room, his screams reverberating through the house. Then, in a terrifying burst of violence, he grabbed both boys by the throat, one in each hand, choking them until their cries became gasps. When he finally released them, Marky and his brother sobbed, trembling in fear. But the nightmare was far from over. Keith left the room briefly, only to return with something far more terrifying: a gun. He raised it and pointed it directly at one of the boys' heads. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, he realized something. The magazine was missing. Frustrated, he stormed off in search of it, ordering 2 teenage boys who lived in the house to help him find the missing piece. While Keith and the teens searched, Marky and his brother were left upstairs in a bedroom with the older boys, who, shockingly, continued playing video games as if nothing was wrong. Moments later, Keith returned, but this time he wasn't holding the gun. Instead, a knife glinted in his grip. Before either child could process what was happening, Keith lunged at Marky. The attack was sudden and merciless. In a blind, frenzied rage, he drove the blade into the 8-year-old's small body over and over again. His younger brother screamed, begging Keith to stop, but his cries went unheard. Desperate to save his brother, the 7-year-old ran into the kitchen, grabbed a chair, and tried to fight back. But he was no match for a grown man consumed by violence. Keith didn't stop until Marky had been stabbed 146 times. With each brutal strike, he shouted the same chilling word, "Die, die, die." The younger boy, horrified beyond comprehension, realized there was only one option left. He had to run. Terrified and desperate, Marky's younger brother managed to escape the house. He sprinted down the driveway, past the darkened streets, and down a hill toward the nearest fast food restaurant just a few blocks away. As he reached the drive-thru, he frantically waved his arms, trying to get the attention of anyone who could help. Customers waiting for their orders quickly exited their vehicles, rushing to the little boy's aid. Through tears and panic, he managed to tell the strangers what had happened just down the street, that his brother was in danger. Within moments, someone dialed 911. When police arrived at the residence, the horror inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. Marky's lifeless body lay in a pool of blood in the living room. The walls and floor were splattered with evidence of the brutality he had endured. Even seasoned investigators were left shaken by the sheer violence of the scene. But Keith was gone. Realizing that Marky's brother had escaped, Keith had fled into the night. Authorities immediately launched a multi-state manhunt. Leads poured in as law enforcement agencies worked tirelessly to track him down. Eventually, the search led them to Youngstown, Ohio, just 19 miles from the crime scene. 9 hours after Marky's murder, Keith was spotted on Market Street in downtown Youngstown. U.S. Marshals quickly moved in, forming a perimeter with weapons drawn. Surrounded and with nowhere to run, Keith surrendered without a fight. He was arrested on the spot. Shortly after his capture, Keith was extradited back to Pennsylvania to face a slew of charges, including simple assault, terrorism, kidnapping, and criminal homicide. In a move that baffled both legal experts and the public, Keith chose to represent himself in court. His behavior during preliminary hearings was erratic, often filled with bizarre attempts to deflect responsibility. At one point, he demanded that the entire jury panel be replaced, claiming that because none of the jurors were black, he wouldn't receive a fair trial. His motion was swiftly denied. The already delicate proceedings faced further delays when a juror had to be excused due to the emotionally charged nature of the case. Nearly 4 years after Marky's tragic death, Keith's murder trial finally began in August 2023. During his opening statement, Keith attempted to argue that authorities had planted a piece of clothing among his belongings at the time of his arrest. However, the prosecution quickly shut down this claim, presenting clear video evidence showing Keith wearing the exact clothing when he was apprehended. In another strange tangent, Keith complained that his repeated transfers between jails and state prisons had subjected him to prolonged artificial lighting, allegedly damaging his eyesight. How this related to the brutal murder of an 8-year-old remained a mystery to everyone in the courtroom. The prosecution, in stark contrast, laid out a meticulous and compelling case. They detailed Keith's violent criminal past, his history of unrelenting aggression, and how his deep-seated rage culminated in the senseless murder of Marky Mason. Prosecutors theorized that Keith had taken out his frustrations about his relationship with Maram on the person he knew would hurt her most, her child. Marky's murder, they argued, was driven purely by malice and an uncontrollable hatred toward his girlfriend. Several members of Marky's family took the stand, including the one person who had witnessed the horror firsthand, his younger brother. Now 11 years old, the boy bravely sat before the court and recounted the events of that fateful night. When the prosecutor gently asked, "Can you tell us what happened to Marky?" The boy's response was heartbreakingly simple. He got killed. He jumped on Marky and was stabbing him. I watched and I hit him with a chair. The weight of his words hung in the air, leaving the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Then Marky's father took the stand. Overwhelmed with grief, he struggled to find the words to describe the emptiness he had felt since losing his son. At one point, emotions boiled over. Unable to contain his fury, he exchanged profanities with Keith, forcing deputies to intervene and separate them before tensions escalated further. Finally, it was Maram's turn. Reliving the events of July 8, 2019, was almost unbearable, but she summoned the strength to tell her son's story. At one point during her testimony, she found herself making eye contact with the man who had taken her child's life. Even as Keith cross-examined her, the same man who had once called himself her partner, the same man who had inflicted unimaginable pain upon her family, she remained composed. Keith, in yet another bizarre move, asked an irrelevant question. When did our relationship officially end? Maram, without hesitation, delivered a response that left the courtroom silent once again. When you killed my son. Throughout the grueling trial, Keith never once displayed a shred of remorse. He sat in court, indifferent, as evidence of his horrific crime was laid bare before the jury. In the end, it took them just 15 minutes to reach a verdict. In August 2023, the former felon, now a convicted child killer, was found guilty of both first-degree and second-degree murder. At 47 years old, he was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, to be served concurrently and without the possibility of parole. Marky's tragic death sent shockwaves not only through Newcastle but across the nation. The brutal murder of an innocent 8-year-old boy at the hands of a man who should have never been free to begin with left many questioning how this could have happened. While Maram was undoubtedly another victim of Keith's violence and manipulation, the haunting question lingered. Why had she allowed a convicted murderer into her home and around her children? There was no easy answer. But in the wake of Marky's death, Newcastle came together. Public vigils were held in his honor, where hundreds of mourners gathered to remember the bright, loving child taken far too soon. At his school, classmates left flowers, letters, and artwork on his desk, a small tribute to a friend they would never see again. On July 15, 2019, family, friends, and members of the Newcastle community gathered at St. Elias Orthodox Church to say their final goodbyes to Marky Mason. His small white casket was covered in flowers, while pictures of his bright smile served as a poignant reminder of the joy he brought into the world. The grief was immeasurable, but so was the love that surrounded him in his final farewell. Marky's story is now more than just a heartbreaking tragedy. It is a call to action. His memory lives on, not just in the hearts of those who knew him, but in the ongoing fight to protect children and prevent violent offenders from slipping through the cracks of the system. His name has become a symbol of hope, awareness, and change. Though his life was taken far too soon, his legacy endures, ensuring that his story will never be forgotten. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations. Every day, we see the darker side of the world around us. We witness how people can hurt others in ways that are hard to understand. It's a sad part of life, but it's something we can't ignore. As someone who dives into the world of crime, I'm here to share the most shocking stories and try to understand what drives people to do such things. I'm Michael, and today, I've got another unreal true crime story for you. It was a cold January night in Reykjavik, and Birna Brjánsdóttir was enjoying a night out with friends. The city felt safe, just like it always had. But in the early hours of the morning, something went wrong. Surveillance cameras captured her last moments, walking alone, slightly unsteady, heading toward the sea. Then she vanished. At first, no one panicked. But as hours turned into days, it became clear. This wasn't just a night out gone too far. Something terrible had happened to Birna. And when the truth came out, it shook the entire nation. Born in 1996 in Iceland, Birna Brjánsdóttir was the daughter of Silla and her husband Brjáns. Despite their eventual separation, her parents remained committed to co-parenting, ensuring that Birna grew up with the love and support of both. By the time she turned 20, she was a lively young woman with auburn hair and a sharp sense of humor. She chose to move in with her father, who lived in the suburbs of Reykjavik. From there, it was just a 30-minute walk to the city, a convenience she appreciated. Independent and determined, she preferred earning her own money rather than relying on her parents. Birna's life mirrored that of many young women her age. She was creative, fun-loving, and effortlessly made friends. One of them once described her as a pill of happiness because of her constant enthusiasm for both big and small moments in life. Financially stable thanks to her job in the fashion department of a large department store, she felt lucky. However, above all else, Birna cherished the time she spent with loved ones and the simple joys that made her happy. On the night of Friday, January 13th, 2017, Birna and her friends followed their usual routine, heading to a popular downtown club. Confident and carefree, she was among the first to get on stage and dance to the live music. Around 2 a.m., her friends decided to leave, but Birna chose to stay a little longer. At approximately 5 a.m. on Saturday, January 14th, just before closing time, she finally left the club. Later that morning, when Birna failed to show up for her shift, her friend Maria grew concerned. It was unlike Birna to miss work, even after a late night out. Maria, who had been friends with Birna since primary school, immediately tried calling her phone. But it was turned off, something Birna never did. Alarmed, Maria reached out to the friends who had been with Birna the night before. They all said the same thing. They had left early, assuming Birna had gone home afterward. To be sure, Maria called her father's house, but Birna wasn't there either. With growing anxiety, she contacted Silla, Birna's mother. The news shook her. Birna was strong-willed and independent, but also responsible. She always let her parents know where she was. By that afternoon, a missing person report had been filed with the police. Desperate for answers, Silla took to social media, posting about Berna's disappearance and urging people to share the message in hopes of finding her. Within hours, her plea spread like wildfire, accumulating thousands of shares. Yet there was no sign of Berna. That night, Scylla stayed awake, making frantic calls to emergency services, desperate for any update. But as the hours passed, the silence remained unbroken. At 9 a.m. on Sunday, the police provided a crucial update. Berna's phone had been connected at 5:50 a.m. the previous morning to a cell tower in an industrial area of Hafnarfjordur, a port city located 9 kilometers south of Reykjavik. Upon learning this, Sila, accompanied by several family members and close friends of Berna, drove straight to the location. They knocked on doors, calling out her name, hoping for any clue that could lead them to her. But their efforts were in vain. There was no trace of Berna anywhere. Scylla grew increasingly desperate, haunted by the thought of whether her daughter had found shelter from the freezing temperatures. By then, Berna had been missing for nearly 36 hours, and Scylla was convinced that something was terribly wrong. Yet, to her frustration, no official search had been launched. The police hesitated to act without concrete evidence of a crime. With law enforcement slow to mobilize, the media became the most powerful tool in spreading the word. Journalists had picked up the story, and by Sunday evening, Iceland's 2 largest television networks reached out to Scylla for interviews. She didn't hesitate. If speaking to the press meant more eyes on her daughter's case, she would do it. That night, the story of the young woman who had vanished from one of Reykjavik's busiest streets dominated the evening news, sending shockwaves through the nation. By Monday morning, Berna's disappearance was on everyone's lips. In shops, on buses, and at workplaces across the country, people speculated on what could have happened. The case struck a nerve, not just because of the mystery surrounding it, but because it was unfolding in one of the world's safest nations. With its small population and high economic equality, Iceland had long been known for its remarkably low crime rate. Violent crimes were so rare that in some years not a single homicide was recorded. In fact, the police force itself was unarmed. Detective Grimur Grimson wasn't watching the news that Sunday night. But as he finished dinner with his wife, his phone rang. He was instructed to report immediately to Reykjavik's police headquarters. Driving to the station that night, he wasn't overly concerned. In his experience, cases like this rarely turned out to be serious. Each month, several disappearances were reported in Iceland. In the countryside, it was often hunters or hikers who lost their way in the vast, uninhabited landscapes. In urban areas, most missing persons cases involved runaway teenagers, individuals struggling with addiction, or those with mental health conditions, including Alzheimer's patients who had wandered off. More often than not, young adults reported missing in Reykjavik were found within a day or two, usually embarrassed after failing to inform their families that they had crashed at a friend's house for the night. It was, after all, something Berna had done before. Officers had collected a sample of Berna's clothing from her father's house to aid the search dogs. They had also begun reviewing security footage, though Reykjavik's surveillance network was far sparser than in other European capitals. Low crime rates and public opposition to mass surveillance meant that CCTV cameras were scarce. Still, detectives had managed to reconstruct Berna's movements after she left the club early Saturday morning, though the footage they recovered was grainy. In the video, she appeared slightly intoxicated and hungry, stopping at a late-night food stand to buy a falafel pita. Dressed in black boots, dark jeans, a gray sweater, and a black hooded sweatshirt, she walked slowly along the well-lit commercial street. The area was lined with brightly lit storefronts and street lamps every 10 meters, ensuring that, even in the dead of night, the city center remained illuminated. And yet, somewhere between that moment and 5:50 a.m., she vanished. In most places, a young woman walking the streets in the early hours might raise concerns. But in Iceland, it was nothing unusual. People of all ages, men and women alike, moved freely at any time of day or night, secure in the knowledge that violent crime was almost non-existent. Despite the biting wind and the cold temperatures, Berna seemed unfazed. She had had a few too many drinks, and at one point she dropped some coins, bending down to retrieve them before continuing her slow but steady walk. Surveillance footage captured her from multiple angles as she made her way through the city. In one moment, she turned a corner and headed down a narrow street leading toward the sea. Detective Grimur watched the footage carefully, taking note of small details: her dropped coins, the casual brush of her shoulder against a passerby. Then, in the next set of surveillance images, taken a few blocks further, Berna was gone. She had either turned down a side street or gotten into a passing vehicle. Reviewing the footage again, the detectives noticed something: a small red Kia Rio driving in the opposite direction of Berna. Had she gotten into that car? It was a possibility the investigators had to consider, but the video quality was too poor to make out the driver or the license plate. When the police ran a check through the National Vehicle Database, they found over 100 cars of the same make, model, and color in Iceland. By 2 a.m., Berna's parents arrived at the police station. Detective Grimmer showed them the surveillance footage. When Scylla realized they couldn't even identify the red car's license plate, she was furious. To her, it seemed like something that should be simple, just like in the movies. But the officers explained that real-life investigations weren't that straightforward. By Monday afternoon, with no new leads, the police took an unusual step. They held a press conference, appealing to the public for any information that could help locate Berna or identify the driver of the red Kia. Though Scylla still felt that authorities weren't treating her concerns with the urgency they deserved, she agreed to stand beside Grimoire at the press conference. She told reporters about Berna's love for English and travel, mentioning that her daughter and her best friend Maria had been planning a trip to New York. She speculated that Berna, being friendly and outgoing, might have stopped to chat with tourists on her way home. She also revealed that her daughter had recently joined a dating app after ending a relationship. Detective Greimer provided updates on the ongoing search efforts. The case had now been taken up by the Icelandic Search and Rescue Association, an organization with a century-long history of responding to emergencies. In Iceland, natural hazards posed a far greater threat than crime, making this organization's presence in rescue operations a reflection of the country's unique reality. Ordinarily, Icelandic authorities discourage civilians from joining search missions, as untrained volunteers could do more harm than good. But in Berna's case, they made an exception. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people stepped forward to help, marking the beginning of the largest manhunt Iceland had seen in recent memory. Just hours after the press conference, as Monday drew to a close, an unexpected development changed everything. Two young brothers in their 20s decided to retrace the last known signal from her phone. Following their instincts, they made their way to Hafnarfjordur's harbor. There, between the road and the sea, they found a fenced-off industrial site containing 3 massive oil storage tanks. Nearby, in a rugged patch of land strewn with construction materials, they spotted something: a pair of black boots. The brothers immediately recalled the police reports describing Berna's clothing. Wanting to be sure, they searched online for images of the brand of boots she had been wearing. The match was undeniable. Without hesitation, they took a photo and posted it on social media. Police rushed to the harbor, where they met with the brothers and confirmed that the boots indeed appeared to belong to Berna. At that moment, an intensive search operation was launched in the area. As divers plunged into the icy waters and drones scanned the terrain from above, detectives under Grimmer's command reviewed security footage from the harbor, and then they found something. At around 6 a.m. on Saturday morning, shortly after Berna had vanished, a red Kia Rio had entered the harbor. The red Kia Rio was found parked beside a trawler named Polar Nanak, a fishing vessel registered under the flag of Greenland. As investigators reviewed the surveillance footage, they noticed a man stepping out of the vehicle from the passenger side. His movements were slow and unsteady. He was clearly intoxicated. Staggering slightly, he made his way toward the ship before the car drove away. This time, luck was on the police's side. The license plate was fully visible, allowing them to quickly trace the vehicle back to a rental company. Upon contacting the business, officers learned that the car had been rented by a crew member of the very fishing vessel captured on security footage. Records showed that the individual who had signed for the car was Thomas Muller Olsen, a 25-year-old Greenlandic national. When authorities requested access to the vehicle, the rental company informed them that Thomas had returned it around midday on Saturday. Since then, it had been rented out again to a young family. Determined to examine the car, the police tracked it down and inspected it thoroughly. It had recently been cleaned. When they interviewed the family, the parents mentioned that their child, who had been sitting in the back seat, had complained about a strong chemical odor. Upon seizing the red Kia for forensic analysis, investigators found reddish stains on the back seat. However, Iceland lacked the forensic facilities to properly analyze the samples, so they were sent, along with a DNA reference sample from Berna, to a laboratory in Sweden. Meanwhile, as detectives attempted to locate Thomas and another unidentified man seen in the footage, they discovered a troubling complication. The Polar Nanak had set sail on the afternoon of Saturday, January 14th, taking both men with it. Despite the setback, investigators dug deeper into Thomas Muller Olsen's background. They learned that he had a prior conviction for drug dealing in Greenland. He was also a trained mixed martial artist and was in a relationship, though he had no children. With suspicions mounting, the case turned into a race against time. For Detective Grimmer and his team, the urgency was clear. The longer the suspects remained at sea, the greater the risk that they could destroy evidence or coordinate their stories. However, the pursuit of the Polar Nanak was not straightforward. The situation required delicate diplomatic negotiations, as law enforcement had to navigate legal jurisdictions, obtain the necessary permissions, and coordinate with maritime authorities. After an intense effort, they finally secured the approvals. With the cooperation of the ship's captain, officers from the Icelandic National Commissioner's Special Unit were transported by helicopter to the fishing vessel, braving harsh weather conditions. Once aboard, they arrested Thomas Muller Olsen and Nicola Olsen, the second man seen in the surveillance footage. Despite sharing a surname, the two men were not related. The ship's captain agreed to comply with the Icelandic authorities, and after 12 tense hours, the Polar Nanak changed course and returned to Icelandic waters. As the ship was searched, officers uncovered 50 pounds of hashish in Thomas's cabin, a significant find, but not the most critical piece of evidence. What truly stunned investigators was what they found in the ship's garbage disposal. There, folded and discarded, was Berna's driver's license. The document was immediately sent to a forensic lab in Norway for fingerprint analysis. To Grimmer, this was damning proof. He was convinced Thomas was responsible for Berna's disappearance. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, Thomas refused to talk. He denied any involvement, and provided no information that could help locate the missing woman. As detectives worked to map out the movements of Thomas and Nicola on the night and morning of Berna's disappearance, they uncovered another distinction between the two men. While Thomas had a criminal record, Nicola did not. People who knew Nicola described him as reserved, socially anxious, and deeply introverted. He had a girlfriend and maintained a close relationship with his family, particularly with his sister and her newborn baby. Like Thomas, he proclaimed his innocence, insisting that he had been too intoxicated that night to recall much of anything. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the worst news arrived. On January 22nd, Berna's body was found. The sea had carried her lifeless form to the rocky coast near a lighthouse on the Reykjanes Peninsula, more than 30 miles from where she had disappeared. She was found naked, and when the autopsy was completed, it confirmed that she had drowned in the frigid waters. But that wasn't all. Her body bore additional injuries, bruises on her face and clear marks on her neck, indicating that she had been strangled with force before ending up in the ocean. However, forensic examination found no evidence of sexual assault. The news spread like wildfire. A wave of grief and disbelief washed over Iceland. The phrase "I am Birna" trended across social media as people struggled to process what had happened. For many, the shock went beyond the loss of a young woman. It was an attack on the very fabric of Icelandic society. For Birna's parents, the pain was unbearable. Devastated, they refused to hear the graphic details of their daughter's final moments. Meanwhile, the crew of the Polar Nanak released a statement expressing their condolences, saying they hoped for justice to be served. As a gesture of sorrow, the fishing company donated $15,000 to the volunteers who had tirelessly searched for Birna. Both in Iceland and Greenland, candlelit vigils were held. In Reykjavik, more than 8,000 people gathered for a memorial walk, tracing Birna's final steps through the city, placing flowers at the spot where she was last seen. They ended the procession atop a small hill, lighting candles and sharing a moment of silence in her honor. On February 3rd, Birna was laid to rest. Her funeral was attended by 2,000 mourners, including Iceland's president and prime minister. The ceremony was conducted by the Bishop of Iceland, but respecting the family's wishes, no photographs were taken, as the media had been asked to stay away. Once forensic testing confirmed that the reddish stains found in the red Kia matched Birna's DNA, police formally charged Thomas Muller Olsen with murder and drug possession. His companion, Nicola Olsen, was released after investigators concluded that he had not been present when the crime occurred. According to the case reconstruction, Thomas had dropped off Nicola, who was too intoxicated to recall the night's events. Sometime after, Thomas encountered Birna, and for reasons still unknown, she got into his car. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Thomas never confessed. Over 9 police interrogations, he maintained the same story, though with contradictions. By August, Thomas's trial was about to begin. By then, the prosecution had even stronger evidence. Thomas's DNA was found on the shoelace of one of Birna's boots. His fingerprint was detected on her driver's license, which had been discarded on the Polar Nanak. Surveillance footage showed him buying cleaning supplies and later wiping down the interior of the red Kia. When Thomas entered the courtroom, he covered his face and sat with his back turned to the audience. He pleaded guilty to drug charges but denied the murder. He claimed that he had cleaned the car because his friend had vomited in the back seat. Then, in an attempt to deflect blame, he accused the police of mistreating him while in custody. But then, Nicola testified against him. Though he had initially claimed to remember little from that night, Nicola now pointed to Thomas as the killer. In September, the verdict was reached. Thomas Muller Olsen was found guilty of murder and drug trafficking, and was sentenced to 19 years in prison. In addition, the court ordered him to pay about $250,000 in fines and restitution. Months later, the Supreme Court upheld the sentence, rejecting his appeal. Soon after, Thomas was transferred to Denmark, where he would serve out his sentence. In the wake of Birna's murder, Reykjavik authorities expanded the city's CCTV network to increase surveillance. A new women-only ride service was also introduced, aimed at providing safer transportation options at night. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.